Hi, good evening, Doron. I hope everyone can see and hear me. Um, I'm very happy on behalf of the National Library of Israel to welcome everyone to what promises to be a fascinating and engaging evening. My name, as Doron just mentioned, is Samuel Thrope, and I work here in the library's Islam and Middle East division. And my main role here at the library is as the manager of the Maktub digitization project. Now, I'm sharing the Zoom stage tonight with two very good friends, Dr. Domenico Agostini of Tel Aviv University and Professor Shai Secunda of Bard College. We're here to celebrate the publication of two new books, and I'm just going to share the screen. Give me 1 second. Here we go. There we are. Now, you can see on the screen here the books that I've mentioned. On the left is Shai's The Talmud's Red Fence, Menstrual Impurity and Difference in Babylonian Judaism and its Sasanian Context, which was published just this year, or just last year, by Oxford University Press. And the second book on the right is Nico's new translation of an ancient Iranian work known as the Bundahishn, meaning primal or primordial creation. Now, as you can see, my name is also on the title of that book. I'm the co-translator with Nico of this new English version of the Bundahishn, and we'll be saying a few words about what that is in just a few minutes. Tonight, though, I'm going to take a different role, not as co-translator and not as author, but rather moderator and interviewer. I'm here to facilitate our discussion and to try and sort of plunge the depths of the connections between the topics, what connects the two books in front of us. Now, in fact, the focus of our conversation is not just going to be these recently published books. It's not just going to be what we're writing about in 2020 and 2021, but the books that these new books are about. What I'm talking about, of course, is the Babylonian Talmud, known as the Bavli, the Jewish rabbinic collection of law, lore, and biblical exegesis, and also the religious literature of ancient Iran and the ancient Iranian faith, known as Zoroastrianism. Now, I'm sure that some of you have studied the Talmud. Maybe some of you have studied Zoroastrianism, and there might even be a few people who have studied both. But I imagine that either one or both of these literary works or cultural contexts are unfamiliar to many of us. And for that reason, I want to take just a few minutes now before we actually start the conversation to present a little bit of background and to give some more information so that we can better understand the discussion that we're going to have. Now, here on the screen, you can see a single, or maybe it's parts of 2 pages of a manuscript of the Talmud from Tractate Nida, the tractate that deals with menstruation. Now, this is from the collections of the National Library, and it's dated to the 13th or 14th century. The Talmud, just very briefly to say it, is a central work of Judaism, right? The primary textual authority for the religious law that dictates so much of traditional Jewish life. And while the Talmud itself is a commentary, it's so much more than that. It's, in a way, we can say the record of an ongoing conversation between different generations of Jewish rabbis, ancient Jewish sages, and in particular, those who lived between the 3rd and 6th century CE in the cities and towns along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, located in today's Iraq. Now, what you'll see here, I imagine needs some more introduction. On the screen is a page from a manuscript copy of the Bundahishn. This is a manuscript that was written in India. It's now part of the collections of the British Library in London, and was written down, or this copy in particular was written sometime in the 17th or 18th centuries. The Bundahishn is just one of numerous works composed in the language known as Middle Persian, an older relative of the modern language of Iran that's spoken there today. Middle Persian literature includes different kinds of works, law, philosophy, geography, commentaries on the sacred scriptures, known as the Avesta, myth, and apocalypse. Though the Bundahishn and other Middle Persian works were finally written down in the 9th century, that is hundreds of years after Iran was conquered by Islam, these Middle Persian Zoroastrian works actually convey and carry on traditions from an earlier time, when a vast empire, and here's a map just to kind of locate us geographically. This vast empire, the Sasanian Empire, covered a huge amount of territory at its widest extent, stretching from Central Asia all the way to Egypt, and of course, including what's now the territory of Iran. And it was precisely during the period that the Sasanians reigned, during the period of the Sasanian dynasty, that is from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, that the rabbis were busy composing the Talmud. So there's a geographical and chronological overlap here. The Bundahishn is one of the most important and useful works that we have that helps us understand what Zoroastrians believed and what Zoroastrianism was in the Sasanian period and after. In part, this is because the first chapters of the work tell the story of how the world came to be, as part of the primordial battle in the spiritual realm between a good creator Ormazd and the evil spirit Ahriman. Now, for this reason, because there are these two spirits, right, good and evil, Ormazd and Ahriman, Zoroastrianism has often been described as a dualistic religion, meaning one in which there are these two basic opposing divine forces. Ormazd and Ahriman aren't alone, however, but they're, we can think of them as kind of the leaders of two opposing camps, good spirits on the one side and evil demons on the other. Our world was first created by Ormazd as entirely perfect, good, and still, but the evil spirit quickly corrupted it, mixing evil in with all that good. And since that evil attacked at the very beginning of time, the heavenly bodies, animals, plants, and peoples are also divided into good and evil groups. Most of the Bundahishn actually is devoted to listing and describing these different divisions of the world. Only at the end of time will good entirely triumph and vanquish evil in an apocalyptic battle. Now, there's another important division in Zoroastrianism, and I've already alluded to it, that is between the body and the spirit, between the material and spiritual realms. However, unlike certain Christian dualisms or certain Christian ideas of the division between body and spirit, Zoroastrians don't believe that the physical is bad and that the spiritual is good. Material and spiritual are states of being, not moral positions, and good and evil exist in both realms. In terms of its structure, I should just say, the Bundahishn proceeds from the beginning of time, that is Bundahishn proper in Middle Persian, through the time of the mixture, Wizarishan, and in the end to the final apocalyptic battle, through the time of the mixture, Gumazishan, and then to Wizarishan, the separation, the final apocalyptic battle at the end of time. So readers of the book really proceed along a temporal journey. Now, and as they do so, moving through the 36 chapters of the Bundahishn, they encounter a diverse range of topics, everything from astronomy to zoology. And in that way, the Bundahishn can be seen and can be read as kind of a concise compendium of Zoroastrian knowledge that seeks to encompass and to describe the entire world from the beginning to the end and everything that's in it. And in a very similar way, it shares with the Talmud, we might say, kind of encyclopedic aspirations. So with that background in mind, and here I'm going to go back to our room in the Zoom, I want to begin the conversation. So Nico and Shai, are we here? Are we together?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, guys. So let's begin. let's begin by setting the stage, okay? And sort of talking about this intercultural encounter between Jews and Zoroastrians, between rabbis and Zoroastrian sages in Sasanian Babylonia. Could you both maybe take a moment to say a few words about the place of Jews and Zoroastrians in the Sasanian Empire through the lens of your own text? Shai, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes. So thank you, first of all, Sam, and thank you to the National Library for hosting this wonderful evening. It's wonderful to be here. I come to this question, of course, from a particular perspective, the perspective of a Talmudist. My kind of main interests are in the Talmud and in the Jews who produced the Talmud. And previously, Talmudists really had nothing to do with the study of Zoroastrianism, with thinking about Iran, despite the fact that the Talmud was written at the heart of the Sasanian Iranian Empire. So we could maybe speak a little bit later about how it came to be that Talmudists like me are interested in the topic. But just looking through the Talmud itself and thinking about how the world is organized, we can get a pretty robust picture of different kinds of characters that come up in this world. Of course, there are the people who wrote the Talmud. They call themselves, and they're known as rabbis. And they are rabbis living in Babylonia, in present-day Iraq, which is where actually the winter capital of the Persian Empire during late antiquity, the Sasanian Iranian Empire, was located. They also engaged with other kinds of Jews who were non-rabbis, and that's part of the Sasanian Iranian world. But they also engaged with all kinds of non-Jews, with all kinds of Gentiles. Some of them might be more familiar to you, people like Christians, especially Syriac Christians, Christians of what we call the Eastern Church, religions that you might have heard of in one way or another, like Manichaeans were also present in the empire. But arguably the most influential neighbors politically and maybe even culturally in the Sasanian Iranian Empire were Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrians come up quite a bit in the Talmud. They're referred to as either Persians, and many, perhaps most Persian speakers in the empire had some association with Zoroastrianism. Also we hear of Zoroastrian priests called magi, using the Aramaic term. So just kind of reading through the Talmud, one encounters these characters quite often. And they contribute to the different voices, the heterogeneous aspect of the Talmud, not just rabbis talking to one another and not just Jews talking to one another, but also occasionally these different voices coming in as well. Sam, you're muted.
Sorry, Zoom. Nico, Sasanian Iran was a Zoroastrian empire, was it not? So tell us about the Zoroastrians.
Yes. Zoroastrianism was the official religion of Sasanian Empire. Since the beginning of the Sasanian dynasty. Please, Sam, if you can share this very beautiful picture of, just a moment. Okay. This bas-relief is located in Nakhcherostan and represents the coronament of Ardashir, that is actually exactly, there is the pointer over him, by Ahura Mazda, or Mazda in Middle Persian, the God creator in Zoroastrianism, and the symbol of the principle of good. What means actually? What this bas-relief mean? It means that Zoroastrianism was not only the official religion of the empire, really since the beginning. I will tell you after that something that it has to struggle to be the most prominent religion in the empire at the beginning. But this bas-relief represents the alliance between crown and the clergy, crown and religion. There are two autonomous entities that are collaborating for keeping the good religion of Mazda, of Ormazd, in place, and also for strengthen the Sasanian Empire. What is important to remark that, of course, this Zoroastrianism is a serious, a well-organized clergy with a kind of, I like to say, my students, Pope, that is the Mobedan Mobed, and a hierarchy extremely precise and well-organized, a hierarchy of, let's say, bishops and minor priests. And this organization is really capillary in all the empire. And we have many, for example, seals from Magi, from priests, okay, because they were locating in all the provinces of the empire. Let's say also that the legal system, Sasanian legal system, is based on Zoroastrianism, is based on Avesta, the sacred book of Zoroastrians, and is also based on the commentary of the sacred book of Zoroastrian that is called Avesta. The Avesta was written down in Sasanian period after about 1,500 years of oral transmission. You can see that also the crown promoted many religious activities, and in it we can see really this strong alliance, this strong link between the secular power and the religious power. And of course, Zoroastrians, since the beginning, we have four fabulous inscriptions of one of the most famous Zoroastrian priests, who is called Kerdir. They had to struggle in order to keep their monopoly, their predominance in Iran. First of all, against Manichaeans, this great religion founded by Mani, Gnostic dualistic religion, missionary religion, that finally didn't succeed, even though they were very close to be the main religion of the empire. After that, of course, in this incredible religious background, Zoroastrian, they were interacting with the Jews, as Shai said before, with Christians, and Christians open actually in Sasanian Iran a serious religious and political problems. After that, Constantinus in 313 is promulgating the Edict of Milan. It means that Iranian Christians, they will be loyal to the crown, or they will be loyal to Romans that are also Christian after Constantinus, or at means Constantinus, he made it easier to Christian to profess their religion in empire, right? This is
Right.
really the
Nico, let me jump in. I'm sorry, let me jump in for a second there, because there's a point you just mentioned that I want to focus on. Right, you talked about these connections between Zoroastrians and Jews, Zoroastrians and Christians, and Shai, you also mentioned neighborly relations, we might say, right, between the two. Now we know that one of the ways that that different religions, neighboring religions, relate to each other, and the way the culture is transmitted between them is by means of translation. translation. We can think of the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible. We can think of numerous other instances of the translation and transmission and sharing of religious texts. Nico, the Bundahishn emerged from a Sasanian environment where translation was a particularly important mode. Right? We know of translations of Greek as well as Sanskrit works into Middle Persian during that period. So I wanted to ask you, as a translator of the Bundahishn, do you see yourself, for instance, as continuing this ancient tradition of translation, this kind of like ancient lineage from the Sasanian period? And there aren't very many translations into English or into other languages, for that matter, of Zoroastrian works. So why not? I mean, why don't we have more translations of Middle Persian texts?
Yeah. Thank you, Sam, for this question. First of all, of course, in the Sasanian period, there is a movement of translation. We know that mostly already at the court of Shabur I, the second Sasanian king, there is an attempt to recollect all the knowledge of Avesta. It means that according to a Zoroastrian imperial ideology, we can say, every learning comes from Avesta, from the holy book of Zoroastrian. For this reason, it was very important to translate all kind of knowledge coming from the West, mostly Greek text, and also from the East, Indian text. And we know we have some Pahlavi text telling us about this process of recollection of all this knowledge and translation into Middle Persian. As for you and me, we can say we are a continuator of this movement. I won't say really yes, but of course, Sam, we did something that technically is the same. It means to try to make accessible the knowledge, Zoroastrian knowledge of in Bundahishn to everybody. And this is something that, of course, all translators they do. But from a technical point of view, actually, we had to use the same instruments of these Sasanian translators because we had to use English and also other Western languages in order to translate a technical language, sometimes really obscure, and you know very well how Middle Persian can be obscure and difficult really to find, how? Through the sometimes use of word expression of paraphrases. It is the same that we can find in the Zoroastrian text. When they have to deal with foreign concepts, what do? They have to invent a new vocabulary. They have to invent a new way to explain and to interpret words that don't belong actually to their vocabulary, to their culture. Why, Sam, we have not a lot of translation into English? But Sam, we had the fantastic golden age of translation into Western languages. We know we have translation into English, we have translation of Zoroastrian text into French, Italian, German, Persian, okay? We had this, but in the last years, unfortunately, probably for many young scholars, it is much more important to produce at the beginning of their career a monograph, because it's more important for this working stage. And many people, many young scholars, they really don't feel, the need to fulfill this void, actually, because we have many other texts, Zoroastrian texts to translate.
Well, that Nico, that's, I think you're right on the scholarly front in terms of how people move their careers forward. But the obscurity and the difficulty of Middle Persian text, I think, is also important. And
Yeah.
Shai, if I can turn to you at this point, I mean, your work, I mean, this book and your work in general, is part of a larger trend in the study of the Talmud, right? Where Talmudists are becoming more familiar, not just with the Iranian culture environment, but the various cultures in which the rabbis lived and in which they produced their work. So as you look at the academic field of Talmudic studies today, is it easy for Talmudists to learn about Zoroastrianism as you have? I mean, how do they do it, and how do you go about bridging these two, in a sense complementary, but also very demanding bodies of knowledge?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Sam. And the study of the Talmud and Middle Persian and Zoroastrianism actually has a long history. It goes back really to the beginning of the academic study of classical Jewish literature in the 19th century. But for many, many years, the interest in kind of reading the Talmud next to these other texts had been dormant. And there were difficulties, but of course there were translations that Nico just referred to in various European languages that were accessible. But the problem really was that there was very little in terms of collaborations between scholars of these two fields, people actually sitting down and working together. And the way this, things began to develop was really, as it should be, through personal relationships. So, one center actually was Jerusalem. So at the Hebrew University, you have a great scholar of Persian and Zoroastrianism named Shaul Shaked, who had relationships with Talmudists, students of Jewish history, such as Isaiah Gafni, and the interest began to flourish. And also in North America, where I actually was trained, it became exciting and possible to do this sort of research because of personal relationships. My mentor, Yaakov Feldman of blessed memory, who taught at Yeshiva University, on his own began to study Middle Persian and Zoroastrianism with a great scholar of Iran, Akhtar Shervo at Harvard. And then I also did this, and little by little, through these personal relationships and through the yields of these personal relationships, the classes in Middle Persian, the grammars that have been made available, and then ultimately new generations of relationships, like between you, me, and Nico, have made this all easier. It's still very difficult. There are languages to learn, and there are kind of new bodies of knowledge to master, but it's become much more possible. And we're getting to a point where serious work on the Talmud, on the Babylonian Talmud, must acknowledge and must at least take some stock of the context in which it was written and of the religious neighbors that were in contact with the rabbis who composed the Talmud.
Well, thanks, Shai. I mean, I think I'm glad to be collaborating with you as we have in the past, with you and Nico here tonight. I do want to, I think it's worth saying something though about who we are, right? I mean, your book in particular, but also the Talmud as a whole, and certainly important sections of the Bundahishn, talk about women, and they talk about women's bodies. I mean, that was a topic of discussion and interest and speculation, right, for the rabbis, and also Zoroastrian sages. Even as the Talmud and the Bundahishn debate how, let's say, conception occurs, right, or the significance, theological and moral, of menstruation and other similar topics, the actual voices of women are almost entirely absent from these texts, right? And I should also say, also from this stage, right? None of us are women. So I know part of your project is to actually recover women's voices in these texts. So I want to ask you, how do you go about doing that? And this is for you, and also for Nico. What's the historiographical challenge that's facing those trying to study women and women's lives in late antiquity?
Okay, so should I start or Nico?
Okay.
Yeah. Why don't you start and then Nico?
Okay, so I mean, I actually think there's sort of two parts of the question. There are two directions that the field has taken, because again, these texts not only were composed by women, by men, I'm sorry, even if many of them do speak about women, but they've been transmitted. The scribes, the communities in which they were transmitted through centuries were men, and until very recently. Even people, scholars who study these texts were also men. So you have really sort of a male-dominated world, which creates serious problems when you're interested in what these texts have to say about women, and the question of whether women's voices can really be recovered. So there really have been sort of, at least in Talmudic studies, sort of two views on this. One would be that no, women's voices cannot be recovered from these texts. They're just been filtered too much through the gaze of men. And then the other possibility is yes, women's voices can be recovered. And each of these two possibilities, has two kind of consequences. If women's voices can't be recovered, so then what is there to do? Is there anything to do kind of on the question of women, Jewish women, Zoroastrian women in late antiquity? And the answer would be something like, we could say something about what men thought about women, right? But the other possibility, which is difficult and controversial, is that maybe there are ways to recover the voices of women. And one has to read against the grain, right? One has to kind of peer underneath the text to see whether there might be traditions that initially, originated among women, or other kind of techniques that are taken from fields like the study of folklore to recreate even the communities, the non-elite kind of intellectual communities who are producing these texts. So the jury's still out on kind of this question and whether it's possible. In my book, I tried to kind of work in both modes. Frankly, the one that says that we can't recover the voices of women is a depressing mode, but it might be more accurate. But I sort of gravitated to at least the attempt to kind of hear those voices, even when it becomes difficult.
All right, thanks, Shai. Nico, what's your take?
Sam, what I think, sometimes I'm very confused when I have to think about women in Zoroastrianism. We know that in the most ancient part of Avesta, in the Gathas, the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster in the Greek sources, is addressing to men and women. And we also know that in some Pahlavi text, it appears clear that there is a certain equality between men and women. For example, they have the same basic tenets to respect. They have the same hope of salvation and the same kind of punishments in afterlife. Women can be witness in trials. They can be even judged. They can be priest in a certain ritual only for women. We have this kind of things extremely interesting, right? On the other side, there are two things to say. As in a very interesting article of Abde Young, he was able to describe this contradiction between Pahlavi Middle Persian sources, Zoroastrian sources, because on the other side, we know that according to the legal system, we have mostly three categories. The first category is only, in the first category, there are only men. In the second, women, children, and Zoroastrian slaves. In the third, there are non-Iranians, non-Zoroastrians. And women actually is always under the authority of her husband or of the most important male of the family. We don't have even enough material to try to pursue the second perspective of Shai, to understand if it's possible to find how women felt in late antiquity Zoroastrianism, because we have not actually sources. And Sam, you know that in the Bundahishn, we read and we translated the most misogynist passage on women is in the chapter 14, subchapter 14a, where Ahura Mazda, the God creator, tells women that they are helper, but also tormentor of the God. And this subchapter actually is also related to another subchapters, very racist. You know, we don't really know in Bundahishn how the figure of a woman is really rising up. And this is really the big problem. We know also that in the 13th, 14th century in Zoroastrianism, in some Zoroastrian texts very late, we can say, the priestly prerogative that they had during the Sasanian period, they disappear because they have not anymore. You know, it's quite problematic, I think, to focus on this problem.
Right. So that's, I mean, I think it is problematic. I agree with you, and I think you know, you mentioned this chapter in the Bundahishn, the most misogynistic chapter, and I think that's maybe a good transition to get specific and focus on a few texts. So I'm gonna read a passage from the Bundahishn. This is from chapter 15. It's a chapter called "On the Nature of the Birth of All Species," and as we said before, the Bundahishn has all kinds of different kinds of texts in it, right? Mythological texts, and scientific texts, apocalyptic texts, you know, different sorts of passages. So this is a scientific text, we might call it. It's part of a chapter on embryology. So it's just very short. Read it, it'll take a minute. So the text is discussing how women and how certain species of animals become pregnant, right? So they write, a woman can become pregnant until she menstruates again, but during the first 10 nights after the menstruation, she becomes pregnant more easily. Having washed herself after menstruation, when the time for pregnancy has arrived, as long as the man's seed is stronger, the child will be a boy. And if the women's seed is stronger, a girl is conceived. If both seeds are equal, if both male and female seeds are equal, there will be twins and triplets. So having read that, I want to turn to you. There's a theory of conception that's described here, right? A scientific theory. How does it relate to what we find in the Talmud? And if there is a relation, how did Jewish and Zoroastrian scholars and sages come to have this medical knowledge?
Great. So it's a very technical chapter, and you just read one paragraph of a much longer exposition, and there is a lot going on there. But one of the interesting things that we find in that chapter, which also can kind of serve as a kind of counterpoint to the thinking about misogyny, is something surprising. In that text and later in the passage, we find that menstruation, which normally in Zoroastrianism and in Judaism is seen as kind of ritually impure and negative, menstruation or something like it or related to it actually plays a very important role, a proactive role in conception, in embryology. there's even a term in Middle Persian which means essentially, the regular relations between a couple that produce a child, which means, taking care of the menstrual month, right? So they saw that menstruation was key to conception. The rabbis did as well. The rabbis also, in an expression not entirely different from the one that you just read there, they talk about blood of desire in some passages. And again, something related to menstruation that nevertheless caused a conception. So there is something coming together. That chapter seems to be influenced and different from what we find in other classical Jewish texts, and actually what we found in many parts of the late antique world, which is Aristotle's view, where menstruation was a sort of inert substance that then would be germinated by the active male substance. Well, here we have, both in the Zoroastrian text and in the Talmud, if not equality, there's a little bit of competition in the passage that you read, but some kind of coming together. That seems to have come from the great Alexandrian scholar writing in Greek, Galen. Galen thought similar things about the role of menstruation and conception. And that kind of brings us back to how we opened our conversation with the streams of knowledge in late antiquity, right? Rabbis, Zoroastrian scholars, the rabbis who wrote the Talmud, the Zoroastrian scholars who produced the Bundahishn, were clearly kind of up on the intellectual trends of the day. They were absorbing it, they were reworking it, and they came to similar conclusions, right? They had access to this form of thought, maybe through translation, maybe through some other engagement. And I actually think, as much as it's a very technical chapter in the Bundahishn, and in my book, my treatment of it is by necessity also quite technical, it is a window into, again, streams of kind of intellectual engagement that brought together scholars, both Jewish, Zoroastrian, Christians as well, bringing them to similar conclusions.
Thanks very much, Shai. We've been talking a lot about the Sasanian period, right, and Sasanian texts, and just read a small snippet, right, a technical snippet of the Bundahishn just now. There's a problem I've always had with the study of Middle Persian literature and using it to read back onto the Sasanian period, right? There's a chronological problem. The Bundahishn, many of these other texts were finally sort of took the shape that we know of them today during the 9th century. That is, after the end of the Sasanian period, after the end of Zoroastrianism being an official religion in Iran, after the closure of the Babylonian Talmud. There's a huge gap here. So how do we, and these two texts belong to very different eras. So how do we use the Bundahishn and other Middle Persian texts to shed light on the Talmud and the Sasanian era overall? Now, Nico, I want to start with you on this, because it's a problem for Irenaeus as much as it is for Thomas.
If you allow me, I would like to add something about the transmission of medical knowledge, Greek medical knowledge to the Zoroastrian world. I would like to point out that during the Sasanian times, there was a very famous school of medicine in Iranian territory called Bundahishn, that is close to Ahwaz in modern Iran, very close to it. There, actually, Nestorian Christians, they used to translate into Syriac and Middle Persian many Greek texts. What is interesting that it was an academy of medicine, and probably there they used to elaborate all this kind of knowledge. Coming back to the last question, Sam, wow, it's for us, for Iranologists, is a very difficult job to try to relate this late literature, 9th, 10th century current era, to the Sasanian world, the Sasanian tradition. And sometimes we have just to make a work of, try to distinguish some topics that are for sure not related to the late period. It means, for example, if there are texts where there is no reference to the Muslim conquest of Iran, of the Persian Empire, we can say that probably they might be originally a Sasanian product. You know, we have some kind of topics that we think that they were conceived before or in the late Sasanian period. The second thing to do is to compare this late Zoroastrian text to texts of foreign traditions that are contemporary to the Sasanian period. It is what I'm doing with Zoroastrian apocalyptic texts. I like apocalypse, and people think that I'm now in my universe during this Corona period. It's not true, of course, but I was in my project that is generously funded by the Israeli Science Foundation. I'm trying to compare parts of topics that I found in late Zoroastrian tradition, apocalyptic texts, to Jewish and Christian texts that we know for sure they are contemporary to the late Sasanian period. This is what we can do because, our big frustration is the fact that, we don't say easily that there was a written Zoroastrian literature before the Arab conquest of Iran. It's not easy to say because we have not the famous smoking gun. We know that there were commentary in Middle Persian of Avesta, of the sacred book. We know that few texts probably were translated into Middle Persian, but we don't know if there was a serious bulk of literature, written literature. And we used to say that it's inconceivable that there was not, but we missed the smoking gun to claim. And Sam, this is our big frustration to have this later material it to work,
Right. Yeah, it's very frustrating to work backwards or to have to work backwards.
Yeah.
Shai, how about for you? How do you relate to this problem?
Yes, so this is, again, very difficult to those of us who are interested in shedding light in the Talmud. We want to use whatever we have that's contemporaneous to the Talmud. And yet, when it comes to Zoroastrian texts, almost all of the material is from presumably the 9th and 10th century, right? Centuries later. So I think there are different things to think about when it comes to this question. One thing is that we have to be a little more sophisticated about what we mean when we talk about when texts are from, right? Or when they originate from. And part of this question has to do with the question of authorship, right? In other parts of the world, even during this period, texts in Greek and texts in Latin, you might be familiar, listeners might be familiar with the great Loeb Classical Library, where the great classical corpus, many of those texts are authored. They're associated with particular personalities at particular moments in history, right? And at least it seems, rather easy to think about when texts were written. When you're talking about many Greek and Latin texts, we know when they were written, right? Who wrote them, and that sort of thing. When we're talking about Zoroastrian texts and rabbinic texts, classical rabbinic texts, not only the Talmud, we're not talking about texts that are authored in the way that's familiar to most of us in the West. We're talking about compilations. We're talking about texts that accrued over many, many years, and then received some kind of caste, kind of crystallized in a certain way. So even if we can be fairly confident that Zoroastrian texts were not written down during the 9th century, during the Sasanian period. We still, there's reason to think that they existed in some form, maybe a form that's difficult for us to wrap our brains around already in the Sasanian period. So there's a question of authorship, and the other thing that I'll leave with, which is another point of proximity between Zoroastrians and rabbis and Jews, the Talmud and the Bundahishn, is that the roots of this literature, even if I can hold up your book and read it in physical form, right? These texts originated in one way or another in an oral context. The Talmud as well was composed orally, was transmitted, it seems, at least for the first few centuries of its existence, primarily orally. So the oral context, which was really part of what it meant to be a Jewish intellectual in Babylonia, and also a Zoroastrian intellectual in the Sasanian Empire, also complicates the question of dating when these texts are from, but also as a point of contact between these two communities who were both very invested in forms of oral intellectualism.
Thanks, Shai. These kinds of problems, I think, are what makes the study of this literature so attractive for me personally. That were, issues of power, issues of orality and textuality, issues of chronology, issues of, the difficult task that's placed on the historian to try and recover from these texts something of the real, right? Whatever that might mean. Guys, this has been, it's been a really amazing conversation, and thank you.
Thank you.
Taking part. We have some time for questions, and I see that there are a lot. So let me just do a quick scan to see what I want to ask first. So here's a good one from Miriam, and maybe Nico, this one's for you. Do Sasanian texts also mention rabbis and Jews, like the Talmud mentions Zoroastrians?
Yes, of course. There is a very famous book called the Denkard, for example, or there is another Shkan Gumanik Vizar, Denkard and Shkan Gumanik Vizar. There are one chapter of this Denkard and some chapters of the Shkan Gumanik Vizar. They are dealing actually with Jews. Why? Because in the Denkard, we have a kind of attack against the Jewish that they are considered as the successor of the progeny of Azdag. Azdag is one of the greatest enemy, of the most dreadful enemy of Iranian, and is a kind of half man, half dragon, or just a dragon. There are different versions. And there is also another book that I will answer very fast actually. This is Shkan Gumanik Vizar that was composed in the 9th century. It's a apologetic, a polemical text. And in this book, there is a serious attack against Christians, Jews, Manichaeans, and a bit also against Islam, even though they don't mention Islam really in the book. There is, of course, and there are other references. I try to give the most important. And also the Torah is a book actually that is generated from this terrible dragon, this terrible Azdag. But Zoroastrian is a minority, and they try to survive attacking and try to polemizing against the other religions.
Thanks very much, Nico. Shai, here's one that I think you might be best fit to answer. So many of the members of the audience have asked about more specific examples for, let's say, connections or influence from Zoroastrianism on the Talmud. And in particular, Nathan asks about demons. about, the Talmud, the Bavli has many passages in dealing with demonology and approaching and getting rid of demons. So are those sort of demonic texts, we might say, influenced by Zoroastrianism?
That's a great question, and it actually was one of the first things that interested those earlier, critical scholars in the 19th century, whether references to demons and angels should be, mainly attributed to Persian influence. And in one sense, people think, yes, it seems there's more material that's interested in demons and demonology in the Babylonian Talmud, more than the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud that was produced in the land of Israel. And the theory has been, offered that the demons in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, reflect Zoroastrian influence. Like many things, it seems to be a bit more complicated. The demons and demonology in Zoroastrianism is a much more sort of central aspect of theology, right? You actually, Sam, you opened talking about this division between good and evil, and demons are sort of the minions of Ahriman, the evil spirit. Most of the demons in the Talmud don't seem to play that role. I mean, they're very strange characters, colorful characters. They certainly are negative and they're to be avoided, but they seem to have a different genealogy. And many have pointed to actually ancient Babylonia as being the main sort of source of the demonology. Names like Lilith, which maybe people have heard of. These are old kind of ancient Near Eastern demons, but not Zoroastrian. And yet at the same time, there are certain practices, demonological practices, such as care for the paired nails, that definitely resonate with Zoroastrian context, and probably or likely were there because of Zoroastrian influence.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think we'll do two more questions. Here's one for you, Nico. I'm sort of riffing off a question that that Judith answered about conversion to Zoroastrianism, but I think maybe I'll put it this way. There's still Zoroastrian communities today, right? Zoroastrianism continues to be a living religion. There's Zoroastrians in India, in a wider diaspora, and also in Iran. Nico, how do Zoroastrians today relate to these Middle Persian texts? Nico?
Yeah, Nico, you're muted.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a very important question. We know that till the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of Zoroastrian literature was translated in India, in Gujarat. That is the language of Zoroastrian in India. After that, actually, there were not big movement of translation of Zoroastrian text into Gujarat, or yes, there were edition of text that we had. The Parsi in India, Zoroastrian from India, they are called Parsi. They produce till the middle of the 20th centuries, again, several editions of this text. Also the Bundahishn, there is an edition of Bundahishn with English translation that since now they used, all the scholars use in their articles, research. But now, actually, we have no any real relation between Zoroastrian literature in Middle Persian and modern Zoroastrianism. There is some eminent figure, a priest like Kotwal in Bombay, but the interest of Indian Zoroastrian, for example, for their ancient literature now is not relevant, is not so sophisticated and important as it was till probably 30, 40, 50 years ago. This is actually a serious problem, but This is for example, we know that one of the most important library in Bombay, the Kam Oriental Institute, had some problems in the preservation of Zoroastrian manuscript in Middle Persian and Avesta. Maybe the interest is not as it was before, but
yeah, no, I mean, for anyone who's been to Bombay, maybe there are people here who live in Bombay. The Kama Oriental Institute is one of the iconic buildings in the city and an iconic institution, and there are lots of efforts underway actually to help that library preserve its collections, which has one of the most important collections of Zoroastrian manuscripts in the world, sure.
In nursery, they did an incredible job.
Yeah.
Through the UNESCO, yes.
So, yeah, exactly. And Shai, I want to turn with the last question back to you, and it's a question from Jerome. How have your views on the relation between Sasanian Iran, Zoroastrianism, and the Talmud changed over the course of writing this book?
That's a good question. Because writing academic books and monographs is always a journey and a process that takes many years, and this particular book did take many years, and my views did sort of develop and change. I initially wrote this book and also my first book, The Iranian Talmud, with sort of the excitement and the insistence that we must study, the Talmud in light of its Iranian context. And my view on that has not changed. Of course, it is absolutely necessary to do so. But what has changed is both on the way to do that and on the possibilities of what we might discover by doing that. Initially, I thought it would be relatively simple. I thought we would take, a Talmudic passage that seemed to resonate with its context, whether kind of responding to it or assimilating ideas from the context and put one and one together. But as my research progressed, I realized a few things, one of which is obvious to people who study the Talmud. The Talmud itself is a commentary. It's a sort of second order literature. It's written on a base text known as the Mishnah. It has obviously a secondary relationship with the Hebrew Bible, right? With the Torah especially. And so everything is always kind of filtered through this relationship. Nothing is, in a way, kind of pure. That initially frustrated me. And it certainly has made things challenging, but actually, and this, ultimately is what I discovered in this book and the one before it, is that it allows for a much more sophisticated understanding of how cultures change, evolve, develop when in contact with one another. It's never, just kind of a direct influence from source A to source B and source B changes, but rather it's a complex interchange where, the potentially influencing element is doing its work, while within that, that culture, there's internal work happening as well with its predecessors, with its heritage. So in short, my views have changed in the sense that it's gotten much more complicated, but I think much more fun and hopefully much more honest.
Well, honesty these days is something that is worth striving for.
Such a lonely word.
And I think that maybe there's a great point to end on, that the conversations like the one we're having tonight are the conversations that will allow this sort of research to continue to grow and to be more fruitful. When we can all get in the same room together, even if it's not really in the same room together, it's only on Zoom, there's a lot of things that can happen. So thank you to you both again. Thank you, Shai. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Doron, for putting this together.
Thank you,
Thanks also
thank you to
to the
everybody.
National Library for hosting us for this event. Thank you to everyone who participated. There'll be a recording available on the library website. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Daron, back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Bye. Good evening. Bye.